Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. This is our last one of the semester, so after today, you're out of luck until January 24th. The Forum is an initiative of the Humanities program at Providence College. My name is Ian Bernhoff, and I direct it. The Forum each Friday, basically, it offers the Providence College community an opportunity to gather together, to hear from scholars from around the world, to encounter new ideas and diverse perspectives, and to deepen our appreciation for the humanities. Today's forum is a particularly special one, which is made possible by a generous grant from the Program for Leadership and Character at Wake Forest University. It's part of their Educating Character initiative, and this initiative aims to equip institutions of higher learning with the resources, funding, and support needed to integrate character education into their distinctive institutional contexts, curricula, and cultures. So basically, it's looking for ways to think about how do we grow in character, how do we grow in virtue, how are we formed as people, and what role does education play in that? What role should higher education play in that? Now, when the Humanities program applied for a grant last spring, we hope to give the PC community an opportunity to reflect on character formation and on leadership development through conversations that take place in the classroom, through events that happen around campus, and also through excursion experiences around the world. This is obviously the conversations around campus kind of thing. And when we were thinking about how we wanted to incorporate the forum into this, one of the very first names that came to mind that we wanted to invite was Rob Henderson. Now, I think he's going to share with you some of the details of his story today, which is, it's a remarkable story. It's garnered national attention, and it's the focus of his national best-selling debut, book Troubled, a Memoir of Foster Care, Family, and Social Class. So instead of kind of giving you his bio, I want to begin with this quote that I really like from Frederick Douglass. It's from a speech entitled Self-Made Men. And in that speech, he defines self-made people as the individuals who, quote, under peculiar difficulties and without the ordinary helps of favoring circumstances, have attained knowledge, usefulness, power, and position, and have learned from themselves the best uses to which life can be put in this world, and the exercise of these uses to build up worthy character. Now, I don't know whether Dr. Henderson subscribes to the whole kind of like self-made ideology based on some of the things I've read that he has to say about the importance of environment and structure. I have my doubts, but I love the quote, and I think it's a good way of saying, like, hey, this is why you should pay attention today, because here's somebody who's come from a very rough background, joined the Air Force at the age of 17, and then went on to obtain a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Yale, and a PhD in Psychology from the University of Cambridge, where he studied as a Gates Cambridge Scholar. Today, he's a columnist at the Free Press and the Boston Globe, and he's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and among other outlets. Now, a few quick reminders before I hand this microphone over for good. One is, and it looks like most of you have done that, maybe not you sneaky people in the back, but take those screens, close them down, and be fully present in the room during the duration of Dr. Henderson's talk. First, we'll hear from him directly. There will be Q&A to follow, and you should know by now that it is our ironclad tradition the student has to ask the first question. So get those question wheels turning. And when the microphone comes to you, if you could just say your name and your major before you ask your question, that would be perfect. And then the last thing to note is there's always, and especially today, a reception right down the hall in the Fiandella Great Room with some wonderful food and drinks. Please join us there to continue the conversation, get your weekend started right. And now please give a robust Providence College round of applause to Dr. Rob Henderson.
All right, thanks, Ian. Thanks to everyone who helped to organize this event. Thanks to all of you for coming out today. Yeah, on the self-made point, I have conflicting feelings about it. I mean, if you start out in a position of misfortune and find a way to remake your life in some way, I guess, you are responsible for that. Is that the same thing as self-made? Well, maybe we can help to answer that during this during this discussion today. So I had a lot of self-doubts when I started to write this book. How many of you have read it, by the way? How many of you have read? That's a pretty fair number of you. I started writing this book when I was 29, and I was initially plagued by self-doubt because, writing a book in general is a challenging task. Writers in general are known for, anxieties and insecurities and so on. But, I was young, writing about my own life, and I remember when I started this project, I spoke with a professor. This was at the University of Cambridge in England about this, and I asked him, do you think I'm too young to write a memoir? And he responded, no, it's an American tradition. You guys love writing about yourselves, especially the young ones. And I think he was referring to books like Educated by Tara Westover and Hillbilly LG by J.D. Vance, and there's some others. I think Barack Obama wrote Dreams from My Father when he was in his early 30s when that book came out. And in hindsight, I'm glad that I wrote this book at such a young age, because it very much is a coming-of-age story. Particularly the first half of the book, I concentrate on the first, kind of 17 years of my life or so, from my earliest memories through my high school graduation and then off to the military. And I spoke with a professor, former professor of mine at Yale, about this, and he told me that often memoirists and autobiographers, it's helpful to have people around you from different stages of your life to help you corroborate your memories and to refresh your recollections. But as you age, my former professor is telling me, your friends have a habit of dying on you, and you don't necessarily have access to others as that kind of social resource. But my friends are still around. My sister, I had endless conversations with a lot of people in my life as I was putting this book together. And the memories of my early life are still very fresh. So maybe it was an advantage in some ways to write this book when I did. And in the preface of this book, I start to give the reader a sense of the book they're about to read by introducing the reader using my name, so my three names and their origins. My first name, so my full name, Robert Kim Henderson. My first name, Robert, comes from my biological father, whom I've never met. The only information I have about him is his name, which is in some documents from the social workers who were responsible for my case when I was in the foster care system in Los Angeles. My second name, Kim, comes from my mother. So she came to the U.S., came to California from Seoul as a young woman, from South Korea, and this was, she was intending to study, but started doing drugs and started partying, and her life very quickly unraveled. And so my earliest memory is with her, my mother, when I was 3 years old, and I'm clinging to her lap, and there are two police officers standing over us, and I knew that they were there to pull us apart. I didn't know why I knew that, but I just had this feeling. And later I learned what happened was my mother, she was severely addicted to drugs by this point, and she would have visitors coming in and out of the apartment at all hours of the day and night. Shortly after I was born, we were homeless, we lived in a car, and then eventually we settled in this slum apartment in Westlake, which at that time in the early 90s was a pretty rundown part of Los Angeles. So the police came, and they questioned my mother. She was also questioned by a forensic psychologist. They interviewed her and asked her, "Where is this boy's father? Because you're not in a position to take care of him." And she said she didn't know. And so that was the only information I had about my father, was his first name, Robert. But a couple of years ago, I took this 23andMe genetic ancestry test. So I went my whole life not really knowing that much about that side of my family. So I took this 23andMe and discovered that I'm half Mexican on my father's side. So I'm reading these results and I'm thinking, I wish I'd known that when I was applying for college. I mean, everything ended up working out anyway, but every little bit helps. And so that was new information for me. My final name, Henderson, it comes from my adoptive family. So I was taken from my mother at age 3 and placed into the Los Angeles County foster care system. And I spent the next just shy of 5 years living in 7 different foster homes all around Los Angeles. And I write in the book about the kind of effect this has on a young child. So initially, taken from my mother was extremely emotionally upsetting, a lot of crying, a lot of tantrums and extreme distress. I had the same reaction when my social worker came and took me to the next home and the home after that. But by the 3rd home, the 4th home, the 5th home, the 6th home, the 7th home, I started to essentially shut down my emotions. And it was essentially a coping response. Human beings in general, but especially small children, to confront that kind of uncertainty and instability is extremely upsetting, and so the body copes by sort of sealing yourself off from your own emotions. But what I found as a kid was not only did I have difficulty feeling negative emotions after multiple placements, but I also had, as a result of this, also difficulty experiencing positive emotions as well. And I remember my final foster home, the 7th home I lived in. I was doing so badly in school. I was changing homes every few months, changing schools and school districts, different teachers, and I didn't know how to read. So this was 2nd grade by this point, and I still didn't know how to read. I barely knew the alphabet, and my foster mother and my teacher and my social worker, they were concerned that I might have had a learning disability, and so they brought a psychologist to the home and administered a test, and I'm taking this test, and I distinctly remember being uninterested in this test. I thought, I already went to school that day, and now I'm being asked more kind of questions and having to read lines and respond to this adult's prompts. And so this was an IQ test, and I scored slightly below average overall, but I scored dramatically below average on the verbal section. Again, because I was changing schools, no one read to me at home, I didn't know how to read. And so fortunately, my overall score was just high enough to prevent me from being labeled with some kind of medical condition. And in hindsight, it's funny. You have this kid who's being moved around to homes and very clearly not in a position to excel in school, and the response was to medicalize his condition and slap some kind of label on it rather than looking more deeply at the conditions of his life, school, home life, and so on. And I remember shortly after this, I was 2nd grade. My teacher asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said I wanted to be a scientist. And she said, well, if you're going to be a scientist, you're going to have to work on your reading. And at this time in the 90s, there was a really popular show called Bill Nye the Science Guy. And some of you may know this show or be familiar with Bill Nye, but I responded by saying, well, Bill Nye never reads because you never see him read on TV. And the teacher said, well, you don't see him read, but he does read. Just because you don't see him read doesn't mean he never reads. And so that was interesting on a couple of different levels for me. One was, oh, you have to read to be a scientist, but the other was, that was the first time I'd really considered the idea of people have lives beyond what you see, beyond the sort of surface level. Those kinds of unseen aspects of our lives. So gradually, I did teach myself how to read. Started out taking or borrowing books from the teacher. So she gave me these kind of kindergarten level books that I would kind of hide away in my backpack because I was embarrassed that I was, 2 grades behind the other kids. Eventually, this was about 3 months after this. My foster mother, she sits me down in the living room. She pulls out this video cassette tape. So this was back when people still had VHS tapes and VCRs. And she pops the tape in, and I see on the screen there's this family, and they introduce themselves as the Henderson family. And right away, I'm confused for a couple of different reasons. So one is each time so my foster mother's explaining that this is going to be the next family I live with, but prior to this, I had never seen a video recording of the family before I moved in with them. And then also, they greeted me by name. They said, "Hi, Rob." And I'm 7 years old by this point, and I'm shocked. I'm thinking, can they see me? I'm watching TV. I can see them. Maybe they can see me too. And so my foster mothers and I were sitting there watching this video, and they look like a very nice family. It's a man and a woman and their young daughter, who became my younger adoptive sister. She was their biological daughter. And so the man and the woman, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, they came to visit me shortly after I viewed this video. And they're very nice to me. They take me to this public park in LA, and they ask me, about my life and about school and so on. And up until this point, every family that I'd lived with, I'd always addressed the primary caregiver as Mrs. So-and-so. So the last home I lived in was Mrs. Martinez, the home before that. And so it was very sort of formal. And so I called my soon-to-be adoptive mother, Mrs. Henderson, and this is, I realized that this was going to be a different kind of family when she paused and said, honey, if you want, you can just call me Mom. And I did, and I found that I liked it, because the only memory I'd had of a mom up until that point was being taken from one. And then the other reason I liked it was because, a lot of the other kids in the schools, they had moms, and they had dads as well, although not all of them. And, I had Mrs. So-and-so. That was my, and a lot of as I got older, the other kids could realize there was something different about my family structure compared to theirs. So my new adoptive family and I, we settled into this dusty blue-collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff. This is about 2 hours north of Sacramento. This is a part of California that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. Very rural, impoverished. Most of the adults didn't have college degrees. My adoptive mother was an assistant social worker. My adoptive father was a truck driver. Neither one of them went to college. The other adults in the town, they worked at local lumber mill or the Walmart distribution center. The adults who went to college, they were teachers or worked for the county. And so I'm, by this point, about to hit my 8th birthday. I tell this story in the book about how up until that point I'd never received birthday presents, in part because I was living in the foster homes, but also my birthday happens to be December 18th, so it would just kind of get absorbed into the holiday season. And so I received my first set of birthday gifts. I'm living with this family. I have a mom and a dad. And about 18 months later, they divorced. And this was hard on me. This was hard on my sister as well. And there was some conflict in my adoptive family's marriage. And my adoptive father subsequently stopped speaking with me because he was angry at my adoptive mother for leaving him. And so by discontinuing his relationship with me, this was a way to retaliate at her. And so my mother was heartbroken. I was heartbroken by this as well. And so my mother got full custody of me. And so from this point, so I'm 9 years old and I'm being raised by a single mom. And my mom is working a lot of extra hours. She's trying to do her best to make ends meet. We moved into this kind of gloomy duplex by this gas station in Red Bluff. And so I spent long stretches unsupervised. I'd walk to school and walk back, and I would start to befriend other boys who also came from kind of fragmented family structures. And so, of course, at this time, I was unaware of broader trends and statistics and so on, but I kind of got this front row seat to this ongoing sort of fragmentation of families in the U.S., particularly in the poor and working class areas of the country. And so I had 5 close friends growing up in Red Bluff. And so there was me, raised in foster homes, and now at this time being raised by a single mom. I had other friends raised by single moms as well. I had a friend who was raised by a single dad, another friend raised by his grandmother because his mom was on drugs and his dad was in prison. And this is a very common portrait of what families look like now in these kind of working class areas. And so at this point, 9 years old, going on 10, I did what a lot of little kids do, especially little boys do, when they're unsupervised and they've lived in kind of chaotic and disorderly environments. I made friends with other boys like me, and we would start smoking cigarettes, smoking weed. I actually started drinking beer when I was 5. I tell that story in one of the foster homes. But by 9, 10 years old, we're sneaking tequila out of my friend's mom's liquor cabinet, or going to the local gas station and buying cough medicine and seeing how many of these little pills we could take before we started to feel funny. I played the choking game. I won't go into details of what the choking game is, but it's in the book. I felt weird writing about that in the book, but I recently read Glenn Lowry's memoir, and he has a whole page dedicated to how to cook crack. And so I'm like, all right, well, choking game and crack, and you put those pages together, you could have a really good day. And so, we're getting into all these misadventures, and one of the points I make in the book is that there's a lot of attention paid to poverty, to inequality, to financial stress, and all of those factors accompanied my life. But if you look at the research on undesirable outcomes for young people, low graduation rates, high incarceration rates, teen pregnancy, substance abuse. Developmental psychologists will separate two factors in particular. So what they call childhood harshness, which is essentially poverty, sort of low material resources. And the other factor is childhood instability. And instability is measured by the number of relocations you had in your childhood, how many homes did you live in, how many different adults moved in and out of your home throughout your childhood, were there divorces, separations, remarriages, how sort of chaotic was your life on a day-to-day basis. And researchers find kind of either no correlation whatsoever or a very small relationship between childhood poverty and undesirable outcomes, again, incarceration, low graduation rate, substance abuse, and so on. But childhood instability has a very strong and powerful relationship with those outcomes. And even when researchers control for socioeconomic status, they still find a robust relationship between growing up in instability and then later as an adult experiencing a lot of detrimental outcomes. And there was one paper in 2016 which even compared children in affluent families that were chaotic with children in poor families that were intact, and found that the affluent children raised in homes with divorce and addiction and disorder had higher rates of substance abuse and incarceration rates and so on. So all this is to say that, yes, material factors are important. Poverty is extremely unpleasant, but instability seems to be largely responsible for these outcomes. And so my friends and I, we were getting into trouble. We were involved in a lot of mischief. And so this was just before my 10th birthday, my mom had been spending a lot of time with this woman named Shelley. And one day my mom, she and I have this conversation. She tells me that she is in a relationship with Shelley now, and that she loves her. And I'm still 9 years old by this point, so I remember being, my mind was blown by this. This was 1999, and so, LGBT stuff, it wasn't really as well known at this point, and especially for little kids. And so, to me, I'm like, oh, you were married to a man, and now you're with Shelley. But I really liked Shelley, and once I got over the initial, I was kind of befuddled, but once I got over that, I was like, oh, okay. I'd lived in so many different environments by that point. This was like not a dramatic change. And so my mom and Shelley together raised me and my sister into my adolescence. And besides the kind of novelty of being raised by two women, it was otherwise a very sort of conventional, kind of traditional family structure where we would have family dinners. They would check in on me. They would make sure I was doing my homework. They'd go to the parent-teacher conferences. And don't get me wrong, I was still kind of finding ways to skirt the rules and hang with my friends, but by and large, my academic performance improved. I was doing a lot better in school, and this was kind of the bright spot of my upbringing from roughly age 9, 10 years old until just before high school. So I was 13 when I started high school. So yeah, it's about 3.5 years, 4 years. And the summer before I started high school, and this was kind of the peak of my early life of being with my mom, being with Shelley. Shelley and I grew very close. she was a surrogate mother to me. I mean, and after all of the foster homes and never knowing my dad and then losing contact with my adoptive father, it was just nice to have another adult around who wanted to be there, and who clearly was invested in my well-being. So the summer before I started high school, Shelley was shot, and I describe in the book, how the circumstances behind this, but it was an accident, and my mother and I, and the rest of the family, we didn't know initially if she would survive, and then we learned that she would, but then, so the bullet hit her sort of right by her spine, so then there was this concern that she would be paralyzed, but fortunately with a lot of physical therapy and a lot of determination on her part, she was able to get back on her feet, but this was sort of 18 months of effort and therapy and so on. But during that period, a lot of the progress I'd made up until that point kind of fell by the wayside. So there were financial difficulties because Shelley couldn't work, and my mom she took time off to care for her, and the entire kind of emotional configuration of the home changed. It was just all of the structure that I had in place up until that point had dissolved. And it came at at least for me, it came at a very bad moment. I mean, the whole situation is bad in general, but the timing of this, right before high school, and so, on the strength of my grades from middle school, my test scores, I got placed into these kind of college prep courses, the advanced courses in high school, and I was doing just enough to pass, so I was getting mostly C minuses, D pluses in a lot of these courses, and I just found myself sort of reeling from the shock of what happened to Shelley, and then also the shock of just sort of how the whole family had changed in the aftermath of that. And somehow so my freshman year I was placed into biology, and I'd done well enough to move on into chemistry for my sophomore year. And this was the first class where I discovered I couldn't I couldn't just BS my way through that class. I actually had to try if I wanted to pass it. And so I went to my guidance counselor and told him I wanted to be transferred out of chemistry and into the course for less academically inclined students. It was nutritional science. That was where a lot of my friends were in that class. And my guidance counselor did what he should have done, which was he explained to me, if you transfer out of chemistry, you're going to throw off your entire academic trajectory, and you'll be sort of taking a step back on your path if you want to go to college. And I told him I didn't care. College was the last thing on my mind at this time. I had no interest in school. And so he shrugged and gave me this form and said if my mom or my caregiver or someone signed the form that he could transfer me out and put me into this other course. So I took the form home and I forged my mom's signature and brought it back the next day and got placed into this lower level course that was much easier. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't understand about young people and potential. And you can have a kid with a lot of potential, but that doesn't mean he's going to capitalize on it or attempt to fulfill their own abilities just because they have them. You have to have the kind of environmental conditions in place, and I didn't have that. And I, based on the way that I grew up and the kind of difficulties that I'd faced up until this point, I'd never really known what I wanted to do with my future. I had this very sort of short-term oriented mindset of living day to day, week to week. By high school I had 2 jobs. So I worked first as a dishwasher at a restaurant, making minimum wage. which at that time was $6.75 an hour in California. And then later I got a job as a bag boy at a supermarket. And I just looked forward to getting paid on Friday, ditching class, doing just enough to get by. My senior year of high school, I moved out of home the summer before my senior year and into a house with my friend and his dad and his brother for reasons that I describe in the book. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my future at this point, but I knew just through working these jobs, looking at my coworkers a lot of them in their early and mid-20s at the restaurant and then at the supermarket, and seeing, at first I thought that these guys were kind of cool. My friends and I, we would ask them to buy us beer or get us some weed or whatever else they could help us out with. And at first I thought they were cool, but then sometimes I would see these guys at high school parties, and I would think, there's something pathetic about this, about being, a 23-year-old guy riding a beat-up dirt bike and trying to hook up with high school girls, and I don't think that's who I want to be. Maybe that kind of life is fun when you're 17 years old or 18 years old, but when you reach 23, 24, 25, there's something pathetic about that. And so around this time, there were two older male, they weren't exactly role models, but two older guys that I respected. So one was my high school history teacher. One day after class, he pulled me off to the side, and he, like many of my teachers, he recognized that I had some potential that I was shying away from. And he said, I don't know what's going on at home. I'm not sure why you're kind of checked out in class, but I can tell you're a smart kid. And he pulls up a picture of himself on his computer, and he's wearing an Air Force uniform, and says, this might be an option for you. You should consider it. And my friend's dad, who I lived with my senior year of high school, he was also in the Air Force before, when he was younger, and also recommended it to me. And, this is 2007, 17 years old. I don't really, I don't have strong feelings about the military or anything. But I decided to enlist anyway. It was kind of a sense of, it was a mix of factors, not wanting to stay in Red Bluff and turn into one of those guys that I didn't exactly admire. I didn't want to stay in that town anymore. I wanted to flee. So it was a bit of desperation, a bit of a sense of adventure. And sometimes I would bring up the military, and we were in the middle of two wars, so it was Iraq and Afghanistan, and sometimes other teachers or my mom's friends or someone, they would hear, oh, you want to join the military? Are you crazy? That's so dangerous. And for me, because of I was this kind of reckless kid, that just added to the allure. So they would tell me it was dangerous, and that just made it more exciting for me. And so before I went, I had to convince my mom to sign some forms because I was legally underage. So you can enlist at 17 as long as you have parent or guardian permission. And my mom had her share of concerns, but I think she knew that I needed to get out of there too. And so I was able to convince her to let me go. And so 17 years old, I take a bus to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. And this was in August, which was really not the right time to go to basic training because it's the dead middle of summer in Texas, in San Antonio. And it was oppressively, brutally hot. And, it's funny, part of the reason I joined the Air Force was because of those two guys I mentioned. They were in the Air Force as well. That was the branch they served in. I talked to veterans from other branches too. I talked to Marines or Army vets, and they would always say, if I could go back, I would have joined the Air Force. And when I would ask them why, they would say it's just like better quality of life, it's less physically demanding. part of it is just because the Air Force is the newest branch of the military, so it was established in 1947, and so Air Force bases are also just nicer. If you go to an Army base, some of those buildings are from like the Civil War era, like broken down old forts, and like it just looks really. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but a lot of the buildings are very old, and so the Air Force guys who join the Air Force, the other branches they're join the Air Force too. So all right, I'll join the Air Force, and I'm expecting it to be less physically demanding. But as soon as I step off the bus at Lackland, the military instructors start shouting at us that this isn't the fucking chair force. And I'm like, oh, and they're having us do push-ups, they're yelling at us, they're playing mind games with us about throwing our duffel bags and running after them and picking them up and throwing them the other way, and I learned that the Air Force had been deploying with the Army and the Marines to Iraq and Afghanistan during this time, and because their physical standards were lower, a lot of their members weren't able to keep up, and so the Air Force at this time had completely revamped their training program to more closely match the Army's, and so I joined right after this. And so it was very much not what I expected. I thought it would be like, I don't know, glorified summer camp or something, but it ended up being a lot more intense than I expected, which was actually what I needed at that age. I'd had so much unconstrained freedom and so little oversight as a kid, and it mostly just allowed me to make a lot of bad decisions. Whereas the military, there was this very sort of rigid structure that contained my impulses, and gradually I learned that a lot of people think that if you want to accomplish something or do something difficult, you have to feel motivated. People will say, oh, I lack the motivation, or I require motivation. Motivation is the force that propels people to accomplish things. But what I learned was that motivation is overrated, and actually what separates successful from unsuccessful people is discipline, particularly self-discipline. So motivation is, I feel the desire to do this thing, and so then you do it. Whereas self-discipline is, I'm going to do this thing regardless of how I feel. I don't want to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And you can apply that to a lot of different things, work projects, or going to the gym to become physically fit, writing a long essay or a book, just about anything. There are going to be days when you don't feel like doing it, but if you can make yourself do it anyway, then you string enough days together like that, and your life starts to change, and that's what happened with me. And so I was enlisted for 8 years in total, and so this was from age 17 to age 25, which are, those are formative years in any young person's life. Almost no one at age 25 is the same as when they were 17. But this was even more so for me because I'd spent those 8 years in a kind of an unusual environment. And I traveled a lot, stationed in a bunch of different countries. And so as my final year of my enlistment was winding down, at this point I was 24 years old, and finally, 7 years in the military, I decided that maybe I should go to college. I had the GI Bill. I'd taken some night classes at a local community college, and, very long story short, I somehow got an interview at Yale, and I remember seeing the, so for the interview, I spoke with the admissions officer, and I had to submit my high school transcript, which was embarrassing. And she asked me, this is not the typical transcript of a Yale applicant. It was a 2.2 GPA. And she asked me, what happened here? And I told her the shortened version of the story I'm telling all of you. But they still admitted me, and one reason was because I took the SAT. And I didn't take it in high school. I wouldn't have even known how to take it in high school. but I took it later as an adult, and that standardized test score saved me. And this is one reason among others that I've written many different essays defending standardized testing. It should not be the only factor for deciding who should study where, but it should be one of many. And in my case, grades were very obviously not a very good measure of whatever my academic ability was. And in high school, a lot of, those decisions were my own. I was responsible for why my grades were as bad as they were, but I knew people whose grades were bad not because they were mischievous or because they had a chip on their shoulder or because they were ill-equipped to go to school. It was, I knew girls in high school who worked part-time jobs and had to take care of their younger siblings because, their dad was out of the picture and their mom was on drugs or had some other personal difficulties. And so some of these girls were unable to they weren't in a position to get straight A's in their courses because they were doing their best to keep their family together and help their siblings. And so maybe they couldn't get great grades, but if they could set an afternoon aside and take a test, that will reveal information about them that you otherwise wouldn't know. And so I took this test, did the interview, somehow managed to get in, and I arrived at Yale. This was the fall of 2015, and I was so far, I was the first in my family to go to college. I was so far removed from the ongoing discussion in higher education around academic freedom and free speech and whatever, snowflakes and blah, blah. I just had no connection to any of that. I was just excited to go off to college. And so I left the Air Force in August and started class in September. And then in October, what became known as the Halloween costume controversy arose at Yale. And I was confused by this, this idea of this professor at Yale was accused of defending cultural appropriation. I didn't know what that meant. I asked other students at Yale to explain, the short version of this is that the Yale administration told the students to be mindful of the costumes they wear so as to not make other students uncomfortable or to give offense. And then one of the professors at a residential college at Yale responded just to her students in her college saying, you're all adults, you can make your own decisions. Do we need, the administration and bureaucracy telling us what we should be wearing or not for Halloween? And in response, there was this big uproar about how she was defending cultural appropriation and calling her all kinds of names. And I asked some students what was so offensive about this, and there was one student, one of my classmates, who went to Exeter, which is an expensive private boarding school, and she'd grown up in Greenwich, but she told me I was too privileged to understand the pain that these professors had caused. And she didn't know that much about me, to be fair. And at the time I was speechless. I think that was the first time I'd ever been accused of being privileged. But now that I've spent the better part of a decade in and around universities, and I realize the kind of intellectual acrobatics you got to go through to arrive at a statement like that. It's basically like a soft version of stereotyping, I think, that she saw me as a mixed race, cisgender, heterosexual male, and inferred from those attributes that I must have had a very charmed life. And I remember asking students about this because there was a great deal of emphasis placed on lived experience. If you go through certain experiences in your life, this sort of authorizes you to speak on certain social problems, or your voice is given greater weight depending on the topics being discussed. So it was lived experience on the one hand, but then on the other hand, it seemed that the categories you belong to were also important as well. So on the one hand, it's what you go through in your life, or it's the categories you belong to of this gender, this ethnicity, this sexual orientation, and so on. And I remember asking a couple of different students, there seems to be this contradiction. What matters more, what you went through in your life, or how you present yourself and what you look like? And one student told me that the identity categories you belong to determine your life experiences. So those, they're inextricably intertwined. So therefore, I, as a mixed race, cisgender, Asian American male, whatever, by definition, I should be very privileged. And then the other student I asked said that it was dangerous to discuss this, that I shouldn't ask that question. And gradually, through a lot of these interactions and encounters, I came to realize, there were sort of economic class differences, which I had anticipated, but there are also social class differences in terms of family structure, in terms of beliefs, in terms of habits, manners of speaking, preferences. Eventually, I coined this phrase, luxury beliefs, which are ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And a lot of the views that I encountered that are sort of born and propagated in a lot of universities, they have an effect on everyone else's lives. These are sort of idea factories. And gradually over time, I saw that there was this connection between what I was seeing in my personal life when I was growing up and the kinds of fashionable views that were prevalent at universities, and especially at elite universities. And yet when I would learn about, one example of this was, I kind of saw what later became the defund the police movement, but I saw it in its embryonic stage at Yale. At that time, decarceration was very fashionable, of just emptying out the prisons. And yet, Yale itself was a bubble, an oasis with security guards in every corner and very secure. And the students themselves, most of them came from families that lived in gated communities. There are more students at Yale from the top 1% of the income scale than the entire bottom 60%. And yet, if you were to go if you wanted to find people with the most extreme views on policing and law enforcement, you would find them at these kinds of places where people have, live kind of the safest lives it's possible to imagine. Whereas when I think about, some of my friends growing up, my friend who was raised by a single mom, she had to call the police multiple times on her boyfriend and then ex-boyfriend because of how he treated her. And there was a reason why that movement was so unpopular, especially, there were two different surveys that came out in 2020 and 2021, and when you looked at, you break down the results by income category, the lowest income Americans were the least in support of defunding the police, and the highest income Americans were the most in support of defunding the police. And that movement died pretty quickly because it didn't have much in the way of electoral support. Because I think there's this kind of blind spot in the eyes of a lot of educated people. When they think of poverty, they think of crime, they think those two things are intertwined, but the vast majority of poor people don't commit crimes. The vast majority of poor people are law-abiding people who happen to live disproportionately around criminals and actually don't like them very much. But often the only time that we are exposed to poverty is through crime, through sensationalized news stories, or through fictionalized portrayals. No one wants to watch a TV show about someone working minimum wage and obeying the law and trying to make ends meet to support their family, but it's more interesting to see someone decide to become a drug dealer or decide to start cooking meth or whatever. So I would run into these kinds of ideas on campus: decarceration, defund the police, attitudes around the family. I didn't really grow up with any kind of semblance of a stable family, and yet I would hear from students who, the majority of whom were raised in intact married families, that a lot of them would suggest that we needed to evolve beyond the family, evolve beyond monogamy and marriage, that this was this outdated patriarchal structure. And yet when I would ask them how they were raised, they would say I was raised by 2 married parents, and then I would ask, how do you plan to raise your own kids? And they would say, I'll probably get married, I'll probably do what, that's how I was raised, that's probably what I'll go on to do. But just because I want to do it, or just because that's how I was raised, doesn't mean that that's how society should be. And what I was hearing was, I benefited from this structure that led me to study at a place like Yale. I'm going to continue these practices so that my children can also go to a place like this. But my official public stance is that people shouldn't do this thing. We need to evolve beyond it. So I saw this with so many different ideas, where there was sort of what people said in public and then how they behaved in private. And so the luxury beliefs idea started to take shape in my mind. I developed it further when I went off to Cambridge for grad school. And there are a lot of different components to the idea, which we could get into in the Q&A if you want. But by the time I graduated from Yale and received my acceptance letter to go off to study for a PhD at Cambridge, I'd spent a great deal of time dwelling on a lot of these class differences, the way that I grew up, the way that the lives of my friends had completely sort of diverged from my own. And when I thought about that, I thought about how there's this kind of inherent unfairness, because by definition, if someone who grows up the way that I did ends up writing a book, like I'm a very unusual, statistically anomalous person, but no one is going to give my friends a book deal. If you live the life of a normal kid who grew up that way, people just don't want to hear what you have to say. And so I tried to spend a lot of time in this book concentrating on their lives too. And I'll leave you with this anecdote, and then we can switch to the Q&A. So I talk about this in the final chapter of the book. I had 2 friends who went off to prison. But one of them, he cleans carpets for a living now. But I texted him, this was a few years ago now, this might have been 2021. I texted him because I had encountered this line, might have been in the New York Times or something, suggesting that we are no longer allowed to call people who had been in prison, we can't call them ex-felons anymore, we're supposed to say justice-involved person. So I texted my friend who had gotten out of prison a few years ago, and I said, good news, you're not a felon anymore, you're a justice-involved person. And he texted me back saying, like, haha, you're not a college grad anymore, you're a classroom-involved person. So I'll leave it there, and we can switch over to Q&A. Thank you.
Got any hands yet? Who wants the first question? Wait, you got it.
I'm Costa. I was just wondering, what job did you do in the Air Force?
Yeah, so I was an electronic warfare technician. So I went off to MEPS, military entrance processing, my senior year of high school. And yeah, I spoke with the recruiter, and he showed me the jobs that were available. And there was no particular reason I chose that job. I just thought it sounded cool, electronic warfare technician. And so, I repaired radar, updated software, like installed devices. It was, very much a sort of technician kind of job. Not that different from being like a cable guy or something like that. Not the most exciting job. I mean, the part that I liked was like you are sort of on the flight line, in the action, communicating with pilots. And I deployed a couple of times. And so I never like saw combat firsthand. Usually, most people in the Air Force don't. And the other thing a lot of people don't understand, so only 4% of members of the Air Force are actually pilots. The other 96% are support staff, technicians, radar operators, those kinds of things. But I remember, so I deployed, this was in LUD 2012. And, hello? Yeah, and yeah, some of the jets landed, and then I did see a lot of caskets draped in American flags, and that was kind of the closest I ever got to sort of seeing the costs of war. But yeah, that was more than 10 years ago now. So, other questions?
Yeah, this was a great talk, Dr. Henderson, and I'm really glad you could come here. I should apologize if this question is answered in your book. I'd like to read it, but I haven't had the chance yet. But there's a stereotype about people getting into the field of psychology and psychiatry because they have some personal issues, and in their mind, this is a way of systematizing and understanding their own issues. I was wondering if your own background is part of the reason why you decided to study psychology, if your research has any bearing on what's happened in your personal life, and I guess as someone in a unique position, if you think that actually works, if psychology and studying it is actually a way that a person could come to understand themselves better, the way you've done through writing a memoir.
Yeah, well, to be clear, so I studied kind of social evolutionary psychology. It's not clinical, nothing to do with mental health or anything like that. Most psychologists don't have any involvement with sort of the clinical side of things. But I did a lot of my PhD thesis. I wrote about social status, class, some of those things sort of made their way into some of my work. So I'm sure sort of my personal experiences of traveling along that class ladder, that trajectory, that probably did inform my academic interests. Yeah.
My name's Liam. I'm a grad student in the business analytics program here. I appreciate you coming here and taking the time to give us this talk. So I have about zero education on the foster system, but do you think, there's multiple ways I could ask this question, but do you think that the foster system is what it needs to be? I guess in other words, like, is it really there for kids that need it? What would be the positives, or I'm more interested in the negatives, like what maybe could be done better?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really flawed system. I mean, ideally, we would want to get to a place where foster care wasn't necessary in the first place, because people, if they choose to have children, create the circumstances so that those children will thrive and be healthy without having to be placed elsewhere. I mean, one of the recommendations I suggest toward the end of the book is limiting the number of placements. So one reason why I was placed into so many different foster homes as a kid, it's done intentionally to prevent attachment, because typically what happens with foster kids is eventually someone from the family of origin takes responsibility for the child, takes custody of the child. But if a child has been living with the same family for a long time, they are often reluctant to want to leave. And so the system sort of organically created this, solution of just moving the kid very frequently so they never get attached to any particular caregiver, so that if and when someone from the family of origin returns, that the kid will happily go along. But in my case, that was never going to happen. I should have been put up for adoption much sooner, but the reason this happened was there's too many kids in the system. This is vast bureaucratic system, this machine, and I had to go through this kind of mental health screening thing in my final foster home. It was a child psychiatrist, and he carefully looked through my file and realized, his mother is not in the picture, his father's gone, there's no way he's ever going to be returned to his family, so he should be put up for adoption right away, but that should have happened much sooner than it did. I guess like the kind of stock answer, more social workers, more funding, and so on, but ultimately we want to ensure that the system isn't so overburdened in the first place, because kids don't need to be placed in them. So.
Hello, Sandra Keating. I'm in the theology department here. Thank you very much for your talk. I started reading your some of the things you wrote a few months ago, and I was really very interested in what you have to say. There's a lot of questions I could ask, but one I want to focus on that has to do with the SAT that you talked about. I grew up in an area which was pretty isolated, a lot of the similar problems, except in small towns that you were describing, and a lot of people that I know that kind of experience the same kind of things you experience. And the idea of being able to kind of test your way out of that system, okay, when I was growing up was really important. That you could get into college even if you had came from a real disadvantaged system. And in my lifetime, there's been a kind of a souring on these exams. Like, not everybody does well on these exams. They're unfair. They're biased. They're this. They're that. And I found that to be quite problematic. I was wondering. I mean, that's one of the things I really liked about what you've said, is that is for a lot of kids, it's the only way out. It's an obvious way out. It's being able to get a scholarship, being able to go to a school that's challenging far beyond where anything that they could reach. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about what kind of pushback you've gotten against that, and why, and maybe how to respond to that. Because I mean, I have kind of mixed ideas about it, but for me, if it wouldn't have been for the SAT, I would be working in a Walmart in central Minnesota.
Yeah, well, it's something that I have strong feelings about too. Some of the pushback, it's unfair because rich families can hire SAT coaches and tutoring to game the test. But every argument against the SAT can also be applied to GPA. Rich families can hire tutors to help the kid improve their grades. So let's abandon the GPA. Let's abandon grades. There are disparities in test scores, but there are disparities in grades as well. By income and a variety of other attributes. But no one's calling yet to abandon grades. But then if you abandon measures like standardized testing, then admissions committees just place more weight on the other parts of the application, like your personal essay or recommendation letters. And publicly, a lot of universities will say, who writes your letter doesn't matter. It's more about trying to get an insight into your character. But that's the public stance. I've spoken with enough people privately who are involved in these committees that if you have a famous or well-known person write your recommendation letter, it does go a long way. And if you're a poor kid, you probably don't have much in the way of social capital to get, some high-profile CEO or senator or whatever to write your recommendation letter for you. The test is kind of helps to level the playing field. It's imperfect, but you know, it's sort of an imperfect measure among a lot of other imperfect measures. I think we should retain it. So, other questions?
Hi, Tom Hamami, economics faculty. It seems today that luxury beliefs and the schools of thought that generate them seem to have outsized influence within the academy, including, or maybe especially, in disciplines like social work. To what extent are you concerned about these ideas seeping into the actual practice of social work and having negative consequences for kids with upbringings like yours?
Yeah, it's a concern. You know, one thing I actually don't remember if I left this in the book or not. So a lot of luxury beliefs are propagated online, on social media, on the internet, and I'm actually grateful to have grown up when I did. You know, before the internet really took off. You know, the mid 2000s. You know, a lot of these messages couldn't reach me. And so I was just kind of in this town thinking about things. I was reading a lot of books from the school library, and I was always a curious kid, but you know, a lot of the messages that kids are exposed to now, a lot of the luxury beliefs, you know, I think some of it is kind of demoralizing. So, you know, a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And so you have, you know, people who wield disproportionate social and cultural and political power, who pass through expensive institutions, and they promote one set of values while living by another. And gradually over time, this does have an effect on the rest of society. And I think because we have a large modern industrialized society, it's hard for people to make that connection between people in the kind of the top income decile, you know, propagating a set of views and then that having an effect on the rest of the culture. But I mean, if you look at like a small scale society, like a hunter-gatherer society of 100 people, and let's say the top 10 most high status people in this 100-person community starts to propagate certain ideas, it wouldn't necessarily be a surprise if the rest of that small community started to adopt them, if the top 10 highest status people in that group started to espouse them. And so it is a concern. Yeah.
We got time for one last question. Just going to the back.
Arthur, an English and humanities major. So you recall a classmate at Yale saying that a conversation around privilege was dangerous, right? Is that not true?
The question was, what's more important in determining a person's experiences or opinions, I suppose, their lived experience or their identity?
And she used the word dangerous, right?
Yeah. Dangerous to ask the question. Yeah.
So my question is, how do you make people feel as if that's not a dangerous conversation to have? Because that seems to be the impasse right now. Like, we can't have these conversations because they're dangerous, and so they just won't happen. But before any progress can be made, we need to take away the fact that people feel threatened by them. And that's just an observation I've made, is that seems to be an impasse right now. And I was wondering what you thought about making headway.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no painless way to do it. I think people who have concerns, who disagree with whatever the dogma is in their organization or institution or campus should, you know, in the short term it'll be painful, I think, you know, often you're the only person. I mean, I was like this at a lot of seminars in college of just being kind of the only person to call out, you know, or express disagreement, let's say. But yeah, there's I think broadly, you know, people, public figures and whoever, can speak more openly about it and to express their ideas. But then at a lower level, I think all of us should just sort of be more forthcoming with what we think and not just sort of passively go along with, you know, the luxury beliefs and the other ideas that we would like to call into question. But it is, I mean, the question about privileges is interesting. I had this conversation with a professor at the Columbia Business School, and he's collecting preliminary data on this idea of privilege and conversation. So he and his PhD students, they recorded some naturalistic conversations around Columbia, and basically attempting to code sort of how forthcoming students are with talking about like marginalized identities. And they find that students are very forthcoming when it comes to talking about like sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender. But the one category that students appear to be very reluctant to speak about is socioeconomic status or family income. So the wealthy students don't like talking about their family wealth. The very poor students don't like talking about growing up poor. And so there's this one area of privilege where, you know, it's interesting that that's the one that's often omitted when it comes to discussions of diversity or privilege, is sort of wealth privilege.
Let's give a warm round of applause to Dr. Henderson. And join us down the hall.